Well, thanks everybody for being here. I'm Tony Lemieux, the co-director of the Atlanta Global Study Center, and also a faculty member in the Transcultural Conflict and Violence Initiative. So it's great to be able to have a session focused on topics related to transcultural conflict and violence. And one of the things that I wanted to sort of open with is just a couple of brief remarks about how important having this sort of global perspective is, especially with some of the work that we do. Looking at conflict across different, spaces, different places, different times. And one of the things that rings true across all of those, at least from my perspective, and I think, probably shared by my colleagues, is having a sense of, the language, the culture. And if you don't have that capacity yourself, making sure that it's somewhere represented on your research team so that you're able to really reach into and better understand particular aspects of conflict and why something might really be a critical piece that if you didn't have that language or cultural competence or the sort of knowledge that it affords, that you might miss something. And, in some of our work, we really, rely on, to a great extent, people who bring to bear that sort of language expertise, that cultural expertise, that sense of real understanding that then allows some of the broader analysis and the broader work that we do to take root. One of the things that I think is an important point, and I'm not sure the extent that you're all aware of this, but as we were conceptualizing the Atlanta Global Study Center and writing the grant, to get this supported by Department of Ed the first time around, one of the areas that we were able to sort of feature as a strength to play into, whenever you're trying to write a proposal, you really try to play into your strengths and, discount whatever sort of deficiencies you may have. But for us, we had real strength in this transcultural conflict and violence space because of the work, and I, point to Carol Winkler in particular, who proposed this cluster of us, and John and I are both here because this cluster took shape. And Georgia State was putting together these interdisciplinary clusters around particular topics. And when that happened, we started to really see that was an area where not only we were building the strength of the faculty and collaborations among the faculty, but really then being able to recruit really promising and stellar graduate students, graduate fellows, who we also see represented here today as part of the panel, and people who are doing this really important work in this space. And so in that proposal for the Atlanta Global Study Center, we were able to feature that and say, here's one of those things where we're doing this work that has global import and global significance. And I think I can't underscore the importance of that all of these things really sort of fit together. And really, from my perspective, some of the research you're going to hear about today, the perspectives you're going to hear about is an example of the kind of work we do that really reaches across different sorts of international and global spaces, different aspects and elements of conflict and extremism and terrorism, and the way that really requires that global perspective and amplifies that, which again, if you've sort of been at the sessions today, the sort of undercurrent in the theme here is that really having that as part of what we do, sort of woven into the fabric of our research and our teaching and our outreach, and that global perspective is really central. So with that, I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Carol Winkler, distinguished university professor of communication, and the leader of the Transcultural Conflict and Violence Initiative to talk about some of the work we're doing, or she's doing, but it's part of our collaborative project. So please, Carol, take it away. And I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Okay. Thank you all for coming today. And I couldn't have been introduced more accurately in the sense that all the research I'm going to talk to you about today is very much collaborative research that I have done with the doctoral students in the transcultural conflict and violence arena. And so I want to give them credit as much as myself in regard to this because that's sort of the way it started. I want to basically give you a little history first to show you where we've come to where we're going. In the last 7 years, what we've been doing is we've been looking at the media systems that have been basically created by groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups in the Middle East, extremist groups in the Middle East. And we basically, when we started to do that work, and that culminated in a book in 2022 that came out with Oxford University Press. What happened in that book was we essentially discovered that the state-based models that we had for understanding how media systems worked, absolutely, they just weren't appropriate to be analyzing what the proto-states did with their media systems. And so what we did in that book instead was we started by looking at the history and going, what needs to get changed about the state-based models? But then we moved forward and said, okay, given that these all have to be online and how are they're building community while they're building their media systems, how do they do that? We added 4 more things. One was transhistorical references that both set up the community as well as set the criteria for how their media systems ought to operate. The bottom line was the messages from their stories about their former battles and their former fighters set that up. The second thing we added was a transspatial reference, which basically says how are we going to get people to give up their national affiliations and join these extremist groups. The third was attention. In the online environment, if you don't get people looking at your messages, it's not going to work. So unlike state models that have built-in audiences, these guys had to come up with all kinds of strategies to do attention. And finally, resilience, because getting the eyeballs is not enough. You also have to be able to keep the audience interested in what you're doing. So that's sort of a fundamental base for where we came. And now what we're moving into at this point is looking from not at the proto-state media system, but now at the supranational media system. And by that I mean states have now begun to do all kinds of global outreach, and so and they're setting up all kinds of networks to do that. So that's what we'll talk about today. We're going to talk, and the 2 doctoral students that are on the panel today will also talk about global media outreach by RT, which used to be Russia Today, but now Russia's rebranded it as RT. And RT basically has, according to them, as of 2017, 100 million weekly viewers in over 100 countries. And that includes 43 million people in Europe and 11 million people in the United States. The other is CGTN, that's the China Global Television Network, and basically that also reaches 160 countries with 150 million followers. So we know that these groups they're investing a huge amount of money into these initiatives, and the question is, how are their messages changing the globe that we interact with? You can tell by, I hope, from this chart that both of these organizations are very much interested in reaching people literally all over the globe. And you can tell by all the languages that are listed how they're doing that. The method of analysis that we used is basically, we essentially went to Facebook and Instagram, gave us information in the posts that came through CrowdTangle, and essentially what we used was on the Instagram ones, we were using 13,500 RT posts and 11,000 CTGN posts. We took 1 year of data, so the studies you'll hear about today covered that. But when we went to Facebook, that was a 5-year project. So what that is posts. We had 783,000 posts from RT and 438,000 posts from CGTN in terms of what they're messaging and what we're going to talk about today. The method that we used, first we started with the computers and made the computers do what we want. For those faculty members in the room, if it helps, we did LDA and BERT topic modeling analysis. If you're not familiar with that, think of it this way. Essentially, there's a number of words that the computer can put together, and you can see the different colors here, and the words are going to cluster together in terms of they co-occur in certain messages. And so for each one of the colors that are on that scheme, that's a cluster, a topic that comes up. And so the computer can not only give us the list of words that are most representative of that topic, but it can also give us representative text. So what is the text that uses those words that's most representative? And it'll give you a bunch to work from. And so that is essentially how we came to the conclusions that you're going to hear about today. I'm just going to give you an overview of some of our research so you see the kinds of things we're doing. We were interested in taking a look at context variables, and so we wanted to we started in economics as one of the examples of where we went, and so we were going, okay, what's a context variable that would change, and would it change the way people gave attention to RT and CTGN? And so essentially what we did was we looked at we were trying to figure out, we used audience engagement as the message, as the variable, and we did it based on whether people shared or whether they liked or whether they commented on it. And what we ended up finding in that study, in RT's case, was that it changed both the message that came out as well as the audience. So the audience engagement changed, but the only place that the audience engagement changed when the value of the ruble went up was in the United States, not in the rest of the globe. All right. What we found as far as what RT was up to, was that was quite different. They didn't react to that. What they reacted to was when their ruble dropped, and when that happened, they changed the messaging that they put out in Arabic and in French. And so you can see that if you're going to be taking a look at these global media outlets, you've got to take into account both the source, the message, and the receiver, in short. Another thing that we took a look at was what RT was doing with statehood. The reason we did that was because a lot of studies have said that RT undermines institutions in the United States. And we wanted to go a step before that and go, let's take a look at all the definition of state itself, and that's what you see on the screen. These are the definitional components of statehood that were agreed to at the Organization of American States in 1933 and then were adopted by the United Nations. All right? So we started with these as basics. And then we took a look at the topics that came out of RT Instagram basically from September to September in last year. And essentially what happened was we ended up finding that almost 3/4 of the topics that made the top topics for RT actually did link to one of these 4 elements. And so I'm not going to go any farther with that. You'll hear a lot more about that when Alex stands up, because he will do that for CTGN and show you some of the differences of how both China and Russia change the way that they do those on those elements. The last thing I'm going to talk about is I want to set up studies on the media systems themselves. That's where I started this conversation with you in terms of what the protostate media systems were doing. And now we wanted to see what Russia was doing in relationship to those. And so the 4 things that you see on the screen are actually the criteria that the states use and state-based studies use to assess what media systems are. I imagine you can know what media markets are at this point, right? That's just simply who are they targeting, how are they targeting, what kinds of goes where, what types of media products go where, and the like. Political parallelism is basically the link between the media system and the government body. Probably the fastest way I can get that across to you is if you think about how Fox News was operating when the Trump administration was in office and how closely connected they were. You might think MSNBC at this point in time with the Biden administration, when they took Psaki into them as one of their anchors, is an example of when there's political parallelism between a particular part of a media system and the like. Journalistic professionalism is essentially what makes it good journalism. All right? Is it truth? Is it balance? Is it, basically what are you using and how are you deciding when your journalism is good? The last one is the role of the state. Now, in traditional state studies, it's how much is the state investing? Do they regulate the particular media system that you happen to have? Those kinds of things is what the role of the state is. Obviously, that was not the case in the proto-states because they actually wanted to get away from the states, but we want to know whether or not it changes it for the supranational states as well. And so essentially the key finding, what we came up with was, at this point we've looked at RT Facebook, and the big finding is that where in the past we used to leave the criteria for judging these systems to the scholars, right? We used to write assessments of which media system was stronger and that kind of thing. That is not the case anymore. RT is using these criteria to evaluate the media systems that are operating around the globe at this point. So it's become a message strategy, not an evaluation strategy, is the key finding of what we're coming up with. Virginia, and later in this panel, will give you more information in terms of how they're doing that, but I hope that kind of sets up for you what our team is doing at this point in time. So thank you for your attention.
All right, so next up we have Virginia Massignan talk about media system as content strategy. So Virginia, take it away.
Thank you. So I am talking about the last point that was made and was introduced so beautifully. So we're looking at the 4 key dimensions of media systems, as Dr. Winkler mentioned and explained, so I'm not going to go over them again. The particular analyses and the posts that I'm giving you as an example come from our data set of Facebook posts from 6 RT accounts over the last 5 years. So I have RT America, RT and RT UK, which are in English, and then RT Arabic, RT France, and RT Spanish, which are in those languages. And as you can see already from the number of posts that have been published in on those channels, RT places a lot of emphasis on their Arabic and Spanish audience especially. So these analyses were also done through topic modeling. So these are some of the posts that we got from that analysis, and they were the most representative of the media system categories that we have here. So I put the writing that you see is an example of posts from that particular channel or account. And one thing that I want to mention here is that we used sometimes we use translation for the topic modeling, and sometimes we did it in original language. But in either case, the result was always assessed in original language because our team is made up of people that talk and speak fluently all of these languages. So, so whether we used translation or not, the content was assessed in the original language. And so for the media market structure, we can see how some of the posts, and especially in some accounts like RT Arabic and RT UK, they talk about sensational videos or videos that gathered a lot of views. And this is a known strategy that RT has and has had over the years of using posts that gather attention no matter the content to drive attention to their own platforms. And then RT French and RT talk about other platforms. So they move the audience to other platforms. One is, for example, in RT French, you can see find out more at this link, because they were moving their audience to their own website, which was because in some places it's banned, but a website that appealed to an audience that was looking for alternative but serious news outlets. And then the other one in RT is Follow Us on Telegram, that started to appear when they started to be being censored on the different platforms. So by looking at the platforms that they propose, we can see also where they're going to move the audience next. So for example, in Arabic, they publicize way more VK, which is the Russian Facebook alternative. And then in RT American Spanish, we can see the patterns in large national media systems. So they comment to the different trends that we have now with social media platforms, or the decline of social media companies. They use social media companies to highlight either the good things that there are alternative media systems, and the bad thing that these companies are actually controlling the narrative as well. And then for political parallelism, we looked at posts that indicated alignment between media companies and government. What is interesting is that for some of these, in some cases, there was alignment between social media companies and the state. And so we're at the point that we have to revise this media system because we're not sure how to count these media companies. They have so much power that they define, what the conversations are. They have power to censor, we can see in RT. And so it's sometimes they count as the state themselves. So sometimes we see them as partisan, right? So for example, in RT America, they talk about how CNN coordinated with Facebook to suspend access from RT network on the platform. So we see these weird dynamics that have us rethink of how we approach media systems in general. And others are way more clear. For example, in RT UK, we talk about a politician that is writing to Meta and TikTok to ban RT for UK users, so that it's way more explicit in some posts than others. And obviously, when there is collusion, it tends to be between a leftist government and the media. And then in journalistic professionalism, we mean journalistic professionalism in both ways. So it highlights the professionalism of RT, and at the same time, it often downplays the professionalism of journalists in major media. So in RT America, they were talking about MSNBC host Rachel Maddow and how she was apparently upset with Biden for not blaming Russia. And so this speaks to the low journalistic professionality of MSNBC, right? And for RT Arabic and RT Spanish, we can see that they always go through two very esteemed sources. So RT Arabic, they always present news through the lens of Reuters or other major news associations that are considered, objective and not pushing any kind of agenda. And with RT Spanish, they talked about the prestigious medical journal, The Lancet. So they do, the feeling that you have when you read the narratives from these channels are very different. So in RT Arabic and RT Spanish, there is way less controversy on, the topic that they portray. They're very attentive to their audience, and they do set themselves up as a really alternative news outlet that can give a perspective from a side that is other than the West. And for RT French and the other RT General, which is their main English channel, we can see they often have guests that are highly esteemed, and I think that the trend is probably over now, but it was really big, for example, in RT French, and that is because they were big players in the news in France, and so they did had to have these appearance of really newsworthy sources. So sometimes they would portray or they would bring guests that represented both sides of an issue. But then what you would get in the posts was usually a very condensed version that represented only one side. And then with state intervention, again, we can see that the state is no longer just a state. So sometimes it is. So for example, in RT UK and in RT Arabic, we see, and also RT, we see examples of journalists being persecuted or sentenced, or whistleblower being persecuted. And so this speaks to how Western states are trying to silence oppositional voices. But other posts show how these media companies have this power now. And so where does that leave us? And who is the source? So where can we find reliable information? So it's going to be on RT, and RT is going to tell you where you can keep finding this information in case they get censored, right? So we can see that they pay a lot of attention to the audience that they're talking to in terms of everything from the media system to the customs of that audience. And so they will, we also looked at other aspects, and we've seen that they are sensitive to the audience. So they do have this skill and this global outlook. And so we need to have it too to understand what narratives are being portrayed in other cultures, because they're very different. And we need people who are aware of what those cultural conventions are to detect these differences, because otherwise we would probably not be able to see them, right? And so I think that I love the work that we're doing, because we keep finding interesting things, and some from the posts and some from talking to each other. So thank you very much. And I'm
Next up, we'll have Alex talking about the Montevideo Conventions and CGTN. So Alex, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now I'm talking about how the Montevideo Convention's statehood definition functions in Instagram posts of CGTN, China's international propaganda platform. In territorial control, we identified two topics. One is China's space achievement, another is the African continent. The space technology indicates how China would employ non-militaristic means to expand in the outer space. And the showing of African continent implies that there are opportunities for the Chinese to explore, to engage with African for partnership and business cooperations through its Belt and Road initiative. One of its mega infrastructure project, and in comparison to CGTN, we found that RT usually in territorial control, they usually report a lot of things about how they bring Ukrainian territory into their own scope. Then in population control, we identified 9 topics. One is scientific advancement, arts and archaeology, festivals, sporting events, and global remembrances and celebrations, U.S. legal interpretation, legal practice, police practices, and migration and transportation. For example, when we look at the scientific achievements, shows that NASA's full color picture of the universe, black holes in the galaxy. We call this educational population control. And when we talk about festivals, it shows that the festival are set up by the government to help to make the people to pass down their cultural heritages throughout the generations. And when we talk about sporting events, they are showing the achievements of athletes to rally the nationalism among the population. And we want to talk about the global remembrances and like Father's Day on the left and the World Peace Day on the right. We indicate that this is for the purpose of raising the people's awareness and changing their mindset about something. And we also have population control about the abortion rights and around the Roe v. Wade. These topics themselves are the kind of population control when they are trying to undercut women's rights. And also law enforcement and court and police brutality are themselves a topic of population control. And regarding migration, we find that the left photo shows the population control caused by the lack of food. The right photos show the population, the Haitian people, they march on the street to protest migration, migrate deportation, which is a form of population control. And for the transportation blockade, like traffic jams, the flight cancellation, and the resumption, they are allowing or prevent people from going wherever they want, and we interpret them as population control. And in comparison to Russia, we found that although both CGT and RT, they focus on police brutality and law enforcement, and CGT shows more soft content like people's festivals, like celebrations. And in the term of governance, we have 8 topics: China infrastructure, agricultural sector, and Latin American politics, election, economy in the US and UK royal family, and European politics, also environment, climate change, and COVID-19. China shows off its successful governance in infrastructure construction. And also it shows that its land and agricultural management when it is showing the harvesting seasons across regions in China. And the presidential elections in Latin American countries, in Argentina and in Honduras and Colombia, they are highlighting the governance in Latin America. And also the primaries is in U.S. midterm election and also the presidential election in France. They are showing the process of forming the government. And CGTN also highlights the economic issues in the U.S. like retail sales and the inflation, showing how the Biden administration is managing the economy. Of course, the change of monarch in the UK and German election, they are indicating the politics and governance in Europe. And governance also highlights how China is innovating its technology in the field of environment and climate change, and also how the nations around the world, they are gathering together to discuss about the solutions to climate change. And also COVID-19 management shows how the countries around the world to make policy to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. In comparison to RT, we found that when the RT is spending a lot of efforts to delegitimize or attack the governance or the policies of other countries, the CGT in China, it is trying to showcase China's achievements across sectors like infrastructure, technology. Last, let's look at the capacity for alliances. One is China's negotiation or anniversary of diplomatic relations with other countries. One is Western countries and Ukraine, and also the Ukrainian people. The topic highlights how the Chinese ambassador, it is showcase the importance of people-to-people exchange in America, and also when the children, they are making videos to speak Spanish to mark the anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and Costa Rica. Also in Russian-Ukraine war, the alliances show that how the U.S. and its Western allies are providing support and aid to Ukraine. Also, it shows the CGTN, which represents the China's international propaganda platform. It's showing the alliances with the Ukrainian people when it is showing the misery and sufferings of the Ukrainians, and also it framed the Russians' invasion of Ukraine in a humanitarian lens. And this is my presentation. Thank you so much.
So, Priyam Joshi is going to talk about disinformation. Fascinating topic. So, take it away, Priyam.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to start by introducing myself. My name is Priyam, and I'm part of the Violent Extremism Research Group under Dr. John Horgan, who's going to be presenting after me. I study public health and community psychology here at GSU, and I'm really interested in the intersection of disinformation, misinformation, health, and psychology. So today I'm going to be briefly talking about my master's thesis project and also just what I'm planning to do in the near future. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the words disinformation and misinformation, especially in the recent years. They've really gained prominence, but just as a primer, disinformation is usually defined as false information which is deliberately intended to mislead people, and often it's with an agenda to advance something political, social, or economic. Especially with extremism, it's being increasingly and strongly linked, and disinformation is being used to recruit, radicalize, and mobilize supporters. But beyond this, it's also used to create confusion among the public, destabilize societies, and after a violent event has occurred, disinformation is used to amplify that impact. So after a violent event occurs, disinformation just makes that event more impactful and longer lasting in people's emotions and the experiences that they have after. So a lot of prevention and interventions that exist right now cover a lot of different topics, but one of the main ones for disinformation is providing source information, so where the information is coming from, which is essentially kind of like fact-checking. You're trying to ensure that you know who you're learning that from, whether it's from the CDC, NIH, etc. The next one is increasing people's literacy and critical thinking skills. So can you figure out if the information that you're reading is true or not? The next is something called inoculation interventions, which is essentially kind of like vaccinating people against disinformation. So you identify people who are vulnerable to accepting and believing false information, and you try to inoculate them against that. And then finally, reducing biases that people have, because it might be obvious that we're likely to believe stuff that we already believe, kind of like confirmation bias. So one of the interventions is to reduce the biases that we have. So in my master's thesis, these are some of the things that I looked at, so I'm just going to define them right now. Source information is where the information is coming from. Evaluation is the different criteria people use when they're deciding if a piece of information is true or not. And then justification is the reasoning that people give when they decide whether they want to share that piece of information after believing or not believing in it. So in my project, I was trying to answer whether people actually use source information. So right now, a lot of tech organizations, their interventions like Twitter, for example, they like to say that this information might be misleading or this is from CDC, and that's even becoming part of policies now. But I wanted to see if people even use that information when it's available to them. Secondly, what are the kind of what are the kind of factors people use when they're deciding if information is true or not, like whether it's in alignment with their beliefs or it seems logical, just things like that, which can help us understand how to communicate to the public in times of risk or uncertainty. And then lastly, how does this differ whether source information is available or not, and if it's belief consistent or not? So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the study design. However, it was a randomized control experiment, so people were randomized to one of two groups. In one group, they had that source information available, and in the other group, they didn't have that information available, and they had to decide if they wanted to share the information or not, and if they thought it was true or not. So what I found is that source information is important, but it's not that important. And out of the justifications that people gave for why they made their decisions, a lot of really interesting things came out. One of them is that people's need for believing and sharing information is very in tune with who they are. So they will actively, consistently make decisions that are in alignment with their identity. So this goes in both ways, meaning that people will actively share information that they know is false if that means it aligns with their identity and it is in cohesion with their social groups. And secondly, that if they know that an information is helpful and true, but if it goes against their identity, they won't share that. So these are just some quotes from some of the participants in the study. For example, I know this is true, but I'm a Texan Republican farmer. I would never share this. This seems false, but I think my friends will feel supported if I share this. So people are sharing false information without any agenda in a way, or at least not a political, economic agenda. The second thing that a lot of interventions seem to kind of leave out is that people share information because it's funny. And people have a dark sense of humor, and a lot of participants in my study said, this is so weird and false, but it's funny, so I'll share it without context. So because I'm from a public health background, I always think of things in terms of exposure. So the first thing that came to my mind is that even if you're sharing it because it's funny to you, someone else is looking at it and they're believing it. So you're getting exposed to harmful information even though your intention is for it to be funny. And a lot of interventions don't really factor that in. This is especially prominent with incel culture, where there's a lot of memes that are present about incels that are shared by people who don't identify themselves with that part of the community, but other members who are prone to becoming part of that community are seeing them and believing them and constantly getting exposed to those ideas in a humor form. The next finding was related to limited knowledge. So when people said that they didn't know a lot about a certain topic, there were a lot of complexities about how they understood information. So as scientists in my research methods classes, I'm always advised to never use conclusive language, to always say suggested or indicated or this was somehow found, but never a causal link unless I'm really sure. However, this is not true for how the public understands things. Some people said, almost half of my participants said that when words like suggested and indicated were used, they didn't think the information was credible anymore. In words of one of the participants, they said, this information is not sure of itself, so then why would I believe it? And then lastly, people seem to really like sharing stuff that their friends will like, which is just an obvious finding, but it was very strong. And they would actively not share true and important information because they were afraid that it was controversial among their communities. So this has a lot of implications in terms of the interventions I outlined earlier. One of them is that fact-checking and providing sources is not enough. It's important, but it needs to be combined with other interventions. The second is literacy. So in terms of how people understand whether information is true or not, they are differentially vulnerable. So, for example, with the language, some people think balanced language is more credible, while some people think more stronger implication-based language is more credible. So we need to factor that in when we're advising people who are in the positions to give out literacy interventions. The next is identity-based interventions. People seem to really struggle with the complicated nuances, as we all do, with things that conflict with who we are, especially on social media. If it's something that goes against who we're supposed to be, it's very difficult for us to process that and share that information. And this is further heightened in moments of insecurity and uncertainty as the pandemic, and as I'll talk about later, extremist organizations really use that and capitalize that to recruit people in these moments of uncertainty and take advantage of their identity. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, humor is something that should be integrated into our inoculation intervention so we can make people more resilient and also understand when something is a meme or not, for example. So as I said, a lot of interventions right now, like inoculation and pre-bunking, sometimes they focus on topic-based interventions like just against a vaccine or immigration, etc. And those are really important. However, along with that, we need to think about how different people are vulnerable to different styles of misinformation. So some people might be more vulnerable to some kinds of information that are framed in a way that it seems logical, as one of the earlier presentations was talking about. And I think research is already catching up to that. So this is a paper by Ines et al., where they talk about the 3 styles of misinformation that are most prominent after terrorist events. And one of the findings from my research just suggests that we should be encouraging research like this that identifies styles of misinformation and identifying which types of vulnerabilities people have. So in the future, as I said, I want to really dive into these differential vulnerabilities. One of the styles of misinformation that's very common is pretending to be someone you're not. The other style is like taking parts of actual information and framing them in a way to further your agenda. So I really want to dive into what are the styles of disinformation used by extremist organizations, especially in the US? What are the modalities they use with AI and video and photos? It seems to be getting more and more complicated every day. The next, I wanted to dive into how to differentiate between belief consistency and sharing, and what are the other reasons that people share misinformation, knowing that it's false when they don't have anything to gain per se, and adapting interventions this way. And then lastly, something that I have been noticing a lot is that health is really personal and it's really emotionally evocative for us. And as the congressman said earlier, this is not the last pandemic that's going to happen in our life. And the more people's trust in traditional institutions is evaporated or displaced, extremist organizations are using that lack of certain messaging to establish themselves as the organizations to trust. So recently, there have been reports of the far right recruiting people through online gym groups, or even things like diets and vaccines or the groceries that you're buying. Those are topics that are becoming increasingly polarizing, and disinformation is playing a really big role in forming that link with radicalization. So in the future, I hope to work on those projects as well. Thank you.
And next up, we have Distinguished University Professor of Psychology, John Horgan, to talk about trends in international terrorism.
Thank you so much, Tony. I don't know why I agreed to try to follow Priyam, but we all make mistakes, and there we go. Thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here. Hello to you all watching online. I've been asked to offer a few thoughts about trends in international terrorism in 10 minutes or less. So here we go. Just by way of introduction, I'm a psychologist who studies terrorism. And what that means is that I'm interested in how, why, where, and when people get involved. I'm interested in what kinds of experiences people have when they join these groups. And I'm also interested in how, why, where, and when they get out. So that arc of terrorism, if you like. I'm not going to talk about that here today, but instead want to talk about two closely connected issues, both of which are far more complicated often than they need to be, and one of which often gets in the way of us making any meaningful progress. It's impossible for me to talk about trends in international terrorism without inviting you to think, very, very briefly at least today, on what terrorism is. Academics will tell you that there are literally hundreds of definitions of terrorism, and that is why we will never have a unified definition or unified understanding. That's only partially true, and it's actually very misleading. There are hundreds of definitions of terrorism out there, but they all share the same features. And most of the time, they're just minor variations on a theme that we allow ourselves to impede progress that we ourselves can make. This is a typical definition and a non-controversial definition. The use or threat of use of violence against non-combatants or civilians in the pursuit of some social, political, religious, or other ideological cause. Now, when I mentioned a few seconds ago that there are hundreds of definitions out there, these are the three things that they all have in common. Violence, unsurprisingly. Non-combatants, which goes to the heart of how we feel about terrorism. The shock and outrage that we feel when it happens is because non-combatant civilians who happen to be at the wrong place and the wrong time are killed in the name of some cause that they likely don't even understand. And then finally, an ideological cause. Ideology refers to an organized set of beliefs that often justify, serve to normalize, or give meaning to some course of action. In the context of terrorism, it really is about justifying and rationalizing the violence that's being done. It's important for us to know what terrorism is because it is equally important for us to know what it is not. I'm sure you all know terrorism is one of those words that is so heavily politicized today. And it's, if you watch the news, it's, you sort of can easily get the impression that everything can be considered terrorism. Well, if everything can be terrorism, then the word is largely meaningless. And it's often used in an increasingly derogatory way. But it is important that we are consistent with our definitions because knowing what terrorism is not is just as important. This definition, for example, would exclude the vast majority of school shootings that we see in the US today because they're not ideologically motivated. For the most part, they're born out of a grievance, an individual level grievance. That definition would also include some highly publicized attacks that clearly serve to terrorize, clearly caused terror. It's hard to believe that the Mandalay Bay hotel attack perpetuated by this guy, Stephen Paddock, is almost 6 years old. Back in 2017, Stephen Paddock fired 1,000 rounds of ammunition down onto an unsuspecting concert crowd, killing 58, injuring over 400. Did his audience feel terror? Of course they did. Were they terrorized? Of course. Were we, the broader audience by extension, drawn into this and made to feel anxious and uncertain? Of course. The chorus of disapproval that surrounded, especially on the online discourse, this attack was unified by one theme. Let's finally call this what it is, terrorism. It is not a terrorist attack. Stephen Paddock left no evidence of any ideological influence. And interestingly, only very, very recently, it has emerged that his actual grievance appears to have been disaffection with the casino industry. Some trends in international terrorism that I think have been stable and consistent over the last 5 to 6 years. These don't reflect one-off incidents. These are stable, persistent trends that will force us to think about what they mean. The first is that the diversity we are seeing today is one of the defining characteristics of terrorism. If you ask people who study terrorism to give you a profile of the average terrorist, well, a lot of contention around what that means. But for the most part, we've been talking about young men aged between 18 to 24 with an affinity for action and violence. Doesn't really tell us an awful lot, but that was the typical profile. Today, it's men, women, children becoming involved in an increasing array of ways with an increasing number of roles and opportunities available to them. The second, I found, there's a lot to say about technology here that I simply won't have time to get into, but one way in which technology is driving changes today is through increased opportunities for radicalization, recruitment, networking, and even leadership. An extraordinary investigation by Eastern European authorities a few years ago uncovered an online recruitment ring to a neo-Nazi group. The group, it turned out, was led by a keyboard warrior, 13 years old, who had been in touch with another child who happened to be a 12-year-old boy who was the youngest ever person charged with a terrorism offense in the United Kingdom. So the opportunities afforded people today are truly astonishing. Number two, there are also increased opportunities for propaganda and the ability to shock audiences globally. In some ways, I understand the term international terrorism, it's almost redundant. A single terrorist attack can have global repercussions. So to say international terrorism it seems redundant to me. But today, we are more likely to see terrorist attackers live stream their attacks to make us, whether we want it or not, to make us pseudo-participants in live-streamed actual mass murder, thereby enhancing and increasing their psychological footprint for impact in a way we could never have imagined before the advent of social media. Number 4 is connectivity. Now, this is another constant historical running theme throughout terrorism, but today we are seeing really, really dramatic linkages where the time between cause and effect has dramatically decreased. I mentioned live stream attacks a few seconds ago. We have seen, for example, an attack by an Australian right-wing white supremacist on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, directly inspire 5 months later an attack against Hispanics in El Paso, Texas. That in turn inspiring another attack within the United States 6 months after that. The time frames between these directly inspired attacks is reducing at an accelerating rate. The 5th, and something that I have recently written a new book about, is that despite, and it's a contradiction, or at least a paradox, despite all we know about today's terrorist actors, despite all that we have access to through their words, their deeds, and our pseudo-participation in what they do, figuring out what's motivating them, ironically, is becoming harder and harder. In the good old days, we could easily distinguish them between, these big bin ideologies, left wing, right wing. These things don't exist in isolation anymore. We typically see evidence now in today's terrorist actors, especially on the international scene. There's a sort of a pick and choose, a sense of let me choose whatever grievance or whatever ideology provides the convenient package for my grievance. And that is rarely just one ideology. It's 2, 3, 4 or more. We're also increasingly seeing, I call it ideological promiscuity, the ideology hopping. People not getting what they want from one ideology and gravitating to another. Very often even the complete opposite. I don't know that we have figured out how to make sense of that yet, but it is a consistent trend that I think is going to have major implications for us. In summary, I've been teaching courses on terrorism for over 20 years, and I said this way back then, and I say it even more today, but it is defined by its complexity and diversity. That seems to be just doubling down on itself with every passing year. Terrorism is always changing. It is in its nature to always change. I gave you a definition of terrorism earlier, but it is important to know that it's a strategy that is open to any individual or group or organization, be they non-state actors or state actors, and it continues to prove an effective strategy in the short term. I also think that motivation is going to increase in complexity to such a degree that we will eventually realize that we will not be able to explain it. And on that happy note, I will conclude. Thank you.
So we have we've purposefully left time for discussion and questions. So what I want to do is have a mic at the ready to pass around. And just sort of start with a quick question, and I think this sort of stems from across the presentations. But one of the things in our first 3 presentations we saw was the different presentations of information, for different audiences by different actors. And one of the challenges is that I think I see sort of in the international space is that a lot of the content that even the examples that were highlighted they weren't factually incorrect, right? They weren't misinformation or disinformation. They were just a very selective portrayal that any one little bit of that, you may not. It's a drop in the bucket. You may not see, any reason to be concerned with a particular data point. And so one of the questions I have is, sort of for everybody to think about, but with the affordances of the technology where you can kind of pick and choose your media sources, pick and choose who you interact with, select these sources and sources out there that technically aren't doing anything that would cause them to run afoul of internet, providers or social media platforms per se. What do you think are some of the ways that that those more mundane messages, the things that we're sort of seeing in those sources, what's the relationship between that and the more extremist space, if there is any? Is there some sort of thing that you see that where that sort of cumulative sorting in those little bits and pieces that aren't untrue, like how does that sort of fit into this context of conflict, violence, extremism? So it's open to anybody, but I wanted to start with something along those lines. Here.
I just have like a small point to add to that. That is also defined as a type of, not a type of disinformation, but it's called truthing, at least like in some of the literature from psychology, where people will take parts of factual statements or factual things that have happened, but frame them in a way that you're advancing an agenda, or even frame them in a way that you're offering a logical alternative explanation rather than forcing this ideology on someone. And at least some of the instances that I've seen them happen is like when legal authorities will make a statement about protecting a certain group over the other, or just warning about violent events that are going to happen. Certain extremist organizations have taken part of those statements just selectively and saying, what are you doing to protect us? Even though that statement, if you really look into it, has addressed those things. And I think part of the problem is that we have so much news that we're getting exposed to all the time that people don't have time to read the full statement, which I'm not sure what the solution is, but I think that's one of the ways I've seen extremism use that kind of truthing mechanism, especially with statements that legal authorities make.
I guess the reaction that I have to Tony's question is that if you go back to the three general topics that our group was discussing, from the statehood criteria of the Montevideo Conventions, of the economic factors, and of the media systems, those topics weren't selected randomly out of the universe. In fact, they were used by the groups that came out of the MENA-based groups that, like an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS, all three of those things were being used. And so we're seeing a repetition of the same kinds of message strategies across multiple groups, back to John's point, that are happening all over the place. And as a result, with the repetition of them, it's undermining the institutions because it's coming at us from all kinds of sides and all kinds of places. And so in my mind, I wouldn't call it grooming, because I think it's just literally repetition over and over and over again to undermine certain places and try to elevate. I mean, we've definitely got attacks on the current world order in many, many different ways, and it's coming from all kinds of sides.
Well, another part of it is that we looked at the text, but these usually come with images, and so they have a very high emotional component. And so while they may seem innocent, if they can, little by little, when you compile them, because you see this narrative repeating, they can have, more power. And also, I think it can trigger algorithms. So in the moment in which people start engaging with this content, who knows what other content they can start seeing, right? So it might be the connection between that and terrorist group might be, just an algorithm away.
I think that's a really important point. Just even anecdotally, the other day, I sometimes will see like where the rabbit hole will take me, let the algorithm kind of do its thing for a minute, and what videos it's going to show. And if you give it some time, like what I noticed, because what I was trying to do, it's in the research project, the broader research project of which I'm part of. We're looking also at, these sort of emergent groups in the accelerationist space. And so people sort of join those, and the humor point is a really important one. In fact, a lot of the recruiting starts in some of the humor spaces. We're seeing people go from iFunny, for instance, into these neo-Nazi groups. And so one of the things I was looking for is, like, if you watch the sort of, the meme things, and depending on sort of where the locus of those is, and they come from all over the world, but if you watch one, what's the next thing that you'll get shown? And they're making it through different moderation. And within a few, like you'll watch President Biden sort of mumble his words. Innocuous enough, right? He does that often enough that it's, okay, yeah, of course. But if you watch that, and if you let that play out, like what's the next thing it shows you? And then what's the thing 3 after that? And then there's like a little kid crying, Daddy called me a Democrat. Oh, okay, well, that's kind of funny, right? Okay, well, now where's the next thing going to take you? And, you do that, give it 10 generations, watch out. Or you can just go to the first page of Gab. That's a whole other story. But the question I think, that you get at here is that there are these things that sometimes seem innocuous enough. And that's the question, and I think, globally with different standards about how that's moderated, how speech, how free speech is conceptualized and how that shows up is one that I wanted to ask about too, because it's something that seemed to cut across. I mean, in the case of extremism, some of that speech that pushes up there that seems pretty extreme but isn't like an explicit call to violence, depending on where you are, like, that's all above board. And even the platforms, even recent changes in Twitter, some of the stuff that's like really like at the edge, if not over, it's still up there all the time now. So the question I have to sort of just quickly follow up, and then I want to open it up to everybody, is in this sort of space where we don't necessarily have clear standards about, how much is too much or what's problematic, what would you say if a policymaker was standing in the room? Let's suppose Congressman Johnson, came back in here and said, where's the line? Is there a line? Can there be a line? Like, what is it we need to be concerned about, not only sort of in the international nation-state space, but in some of these other, forums and contexts of discussion, like what is the thing that we should be concerned about from a global security perspective? I hope that question made some sense. And if any other questions here, I can hand off the mic.
I have questions, but I'd love to hear the panelist's response to that question.
Yeah, so let me give you this.
Well, I wanted to hear your response.
Try to think of an answer. Go for it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. What did you want to go for?
Oh, no, well, I'm not a distinguished professor, so I don't know what I would say to the congressman right now. But I think one of the most important things to do right now is to introduce media literacy at the grade level education. I don't know, but something should be done immediately, and that's probably the best thing we could do, because otherwise, where do you draw the line with free speech and information? But that is something that we need to do.
I'm a big believer in debate in the marketplace of ideas being an answer to a lot of the problems in the world. And so if I could get the government with a magic wand to do what I would like it to do, I would like it to get in a room with the tech companies and talk about the value of algorithms that not only take you to like-minded individuals, but take you to alternative perspectives, which forces more critical thinking and media literacy into the equation, but would also not go as far down the rabbit hole as what Tony just described. It would take you in a different direction. You would be thinking in different ways. It might confuse some of the things that Priyam was talking about, in the sense of I'm just going to do what my group thinks. If it's not clear what that is in all kinds of cases, then I think we'd be in a better place. Yeah.
What I'm thinking about is when I'm looking at those Instagram posts, I found that now they are using a lot of infographics. Like even they have the picture, they have a photo, they put on the exaggerated larger text caption on it. Then it, I think as an ordinary people, most of them, they may only focus on the larger text instead of, no matter how many texts are there in beside, they may ignore it. I think this kind of human instinct, when you focus on a larger, you tend to ignore what really the detail is. So this kind of I think the propagandists, they are trying to make this purposefully to attract attention, to focus attention on the larger side instead, make them ignore or neglect the details.
Thank you. If there's one thing I've learned from watching appearances or subpoenaed appearances by tech giants in front of Congress, is that the U.S. government is incapable of addressing this problem. Congress has absolutely no idea of what the issues are, let alone the technology. I want to second Virginia's point about digital literacy, and digital hygiene is something that we are going to have to embrace and figure out if that is something that we want to incorporate into our lives, because it is not going to come from policy. It is not going to come from the top.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe, or two. How are we doing on time, sir?
I think we're doing okay. I'd love to come back to that question and that issue, but more to begin with, I wanted to ask Alex a question. I thought you'd done a very insightful analysis of the way in which the CGTN posts were addressing all these different forms of statehood. For someone who's not part of the project, perhaps for those inside it's more obvious, but for those outside, should we be surprised that CGTN is reflecting the Montevideo conceptions of statehood, or is that different to the way in which other national media outlets depict statehood? I suppose that's my first question, and secondly, is your analysis that CGTN is its primary kind of thematic focus, or is this just one element of a broader propagandistic or editorial line?
And thank you for your question. I think I can speak a lot about this, because I think Instagram, first of all, this kind of channel, this platform is kind of not that mainstream to the other platforms where the Chinese government or the CGTN or state media, they are doing propaganda. I think the entire Chinese propaganda system kind of more coordinated one. And Instagram posts, when we are seeing the nice image, the peaceful image, or the softened image or narrative, they are only a part of a larger platform. When we see the diplomats or on Twitter, they are more assertive, aggressive in attacking other countries, governments, or officials. And when we are looking at the other like domestic platforms, those Chinese language platforms, they are more kind of showing how the other governments are doing badly, making the population in China, making their think, okay, the life here is not bad at all in comparison to what's happening in the U.S., in what's happening in Europe. And I think that in Instagram, I think this platform is quite understudied in comparison to other platforms, other media channels. And this platform, it is trying to chart out a kind of different approach to show the other side of China.
I think we are at time now.